In the afterword, what Rebecca Bryant does is read through all the papers in the volume and has little things to say about each of them and something to say about the overall structure. She says that this volume has made me optimistic about optimism. And she says that, well, she's always believed that anthropologists are optimists in pessimist clothing. We all look all dour and describing everything that's gone wrong in the world, so we look pretty pessimistic, but actually we have this larger commitment to being optimistic. Optimists in pessimist clothing. And she says that that has happened since Margaret Mead and the beginning of the discipline, which made me think of the Samuel Collins chapter or his web essay on how Margaret Mead imagined different futures. That we might be able to do something with it. The idea is you're studying, but you're also taking action based on that or letting anthropology inform your action. All right, so that's our first summary. But then she says, the world looks so bad. Global pandemic, climate emergency, return of fascism, war-induced food shortages, impending economic depression. Yeah, that sounds pretty bad. That was before even it's happening in today's world. So she says, why do we even bother? But she says that this is the story of people who are acting. I think it's interesting. People are taking action. So that's how she mostly means it, that they are acting in the world. But she does use the word acting, which we also associate with pretending something, playing a role, even if you don't necessarily aren't that person, you still play that role. And so maybe there is that double meaning, which is perhaps helpful. Maybe by acting, maybe that is one of the points, that by acting in this way, you become more like what you want to be. Who are these people that anthropologists are working with, taking actions? For all, it grew out of work with people who should have despaired and yet chose to do the opposite. And so I thought this was interesting because it's one thing for me sitting here to be like, I'm so depressed and so pessimistic about the world. But if you're working with people who should be in even worse conditions or who should be despairing and they're not despairing, then it gives you hope. And so what she's saying, or the people that are written in this volume, is that optimism isn't just something, it's not just a personality trait, it's not just being naive, it's not just a quirk. It is, as her subtitle of the afterword is, a capacity which we do by acting and is, she says, nurtured with others. I think part of the nurtured with others point is that you try to surround yourself as much as possible. I know sometimes you can't, but you try to bring into your life people who are going to have similar ideas and actions and will not bring you down as you're feeling your own internal optimism. So she also says it's not metaphysical optimism. Metaphysical optimism. What is metaphysical optimism? Metaphysical optimism is just, hey, it's all gonna be fine. It's more like it's either a personality quirk or just a statement, not based on anything, that everything's gonna be great. What she says is what we need instead is existential optimism. This the metaphysical optimism, which is ridiculed as being naive and just being people who are overly theological. So she says that an existential optimism is a conscious choice and form of self-cultivation at the edge of the abyss. So it's not just that you think everything's going to be okay all the time. You're making a choice, even though you can see off the edge of the cliff or into the big hole you're about to step into. And she cites a couple of French authors, such as Voltaire, and Candide. And so Candide is actually a critique of the metaphysical optimism, but she says that in the end, this Candide starts farming and being productive. She also talks about Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and his idea of existentialism. And I don't do philosophy that much. It reminds me of some other people in this volume who are trying to get us to talk about these philosophers. According to her, his idea is that there is no reality except in action. So there's the action part of reality, and then there's that other long quote, which is about man is all the time outside of himself, and etc., which seems funny to me. I am just going to take her interpretation of it. By projecting ourselves into actions with others, we create something we might call humanity. So again, it's this push toward acting, toward being productive, toward projecting ourselves. So that is some heavy philosophy. Continuing with the heavy philosophy, there's a whole point in here where she talks about angst. Even the most optimistic among us have to grapple with the anticipated end of the world as we know it. We are surrounded by dystopian scenarios that are also terrifyingly real. Yes, that is one of the points of this book, is that they're not just trying to be rainbows. You have to have the dark clouds in there too, and you have to make that choice. You have to be aware of these terrifyingly real dystopian scenarios. And I think that this is perhaps even more true in the last 6 months or so than when they were writing this book. So pretty intense. Now, she says that it is, again, action that is at the center of this book. And then she talks about various chapters in the book. One of them is the idea of taking vertigo and not having it just be dizzying and terrifying, but having it be that leap of faith and enabling you to rediscover beauty and cycling and break times during COVID, raising birds, reading, camping, fishing, that we might cultivate relationality. So the indigenous people who are putting on those workshops and doing the release of fish and threatened fish into the stream. So trying to relate to the land, to the plants and non-human animals, more than human animals in their environment. And so that was this indigenous perspective of having optimism, even, or maybe because for many indigenous peoples, as they say, the apocalypse already happened. Their worlds were already destroyed. Or trying to already live in a post-fossil fuel world, starting your own little garden and plants, being the neighborhood gardener. So transitioning, or the transition movement, is trying to see these catastrophes as not necessarily catastrophes, but an opportunity to shift to a more transformative possibility. Or planting flowers where you used to grow crops and food. You can't grow crops and food maybe in that irradiated soil, but you can fill the landscape up with those flowers, which helps to regenerate the soil and just makes it look nice, even on land that is irradiated. Then this idea of collective action, which is trying to do these social movements. So it's not just you're sitting around and, oh, it's being all optimistic. You have to be involved. You have to do that social movement thing. They talked there, for example, about the March for Our Lives, anti-gun violence movement, which is hard to do. We just read this not too long ago, the Anthropology Forward article by Sarah Pink, talks about those technologies and working with people to adopt different technologies into their lives. Robots clearing out asbestos instead of taking over the world. Not too long ago, we read about Hillary King on iterative self-making. And trying to be involved in food distribution, and being involved in this creates this iterative or cyclical process in which you are changing yourself. Also, not long ago, we read about system changers, systems change makers, Alison Gold, and her idea of optimistic anthropology. Like I said, there were two other people she didn't cite, but we read Brian Tilt's work on China, what it would be like in 2060 and decarbonizing, and the idea that there's fate, but also it's your job as an individual to take action. At the end, she turns back to Candide, or The Optimist by Voltaire. But in the end, he turns to action in the world, and this, she says, enables existential optimism. And so she closes the whole book off with this quote from Voltaire, quoting Candide, fictional character. All that is very well, Candide remarks to his former tutor, but let us cultivate our garden. Boom, boom, boom. Well, let's see if we can critique this notion a little bit. All that is very well, but let us cultivate our garden. What might we say to a person who's like, nah, I'm just going to go here and do my garden? One critique is that, yeah, as you've said before, if I'm just going to go over here and cultivate my garden, then it lets people off the hook who are more powerful. So it could still be described as a naive turning away. And if it's just a small group, how many people are enough? If we're only taking optimism in the 10 people that we know, let's say we're at Hartwick, we know 5 good people out of 1,000. Is that great? Is that enough? So the question would be, how many people do you need? Can you just be optimistic with one other person and be like, I'm good here? So I'm trying to think about this. Exactly. Why should I have to do all that? Why should I have to make this choice? Why should I have to try and be waste free? You're the one making all the waste, and it's not going to matter that much anyway. What I started to think too, what if you don't have a garden?
Yeah, what if you live in like Texas?
What if you get kicked out of your garden? A bunch of people like
Like Elon Musk.
or what if you're at war? There are a whole bunch of people with the gardens, and we've seen them displaced and are refugees or don't have a garden anymore. It's very difficult to be optimistic during a war because, for one thing, you're being displaced from your garden. You might be dead. That also sucks. It's hard to be optimistic when you're dead. I don't want me to sound glib, but you can be optimistic if you're still around. But what about the people you lost? I mean, if you lose enough people, you're not going to be optimistic. They're all gone. And then it's also difficult because if you're in a war, then you see people doing bad things and you lose your faith in humanity because they're doing bad things. So for me, it is interesting that most of the examples in this book are people who seem to be, it was either financial crisis, COVID, kind of disasters. I don't remember any wars though. Wars are tough. They're tough to deal with. So there's a legit critique on some of these. Interestingly, though, as I was getting sad about that, I thought about our next and last book, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science. What's interesting about that book in relationship to what I just said is that this person is an indigenous person who lived in El Salvador and had to basically flee the war there. So it is someone who's still in some ways optimistic, even in one of the worst displacements and war zones of our time. So hopefully we'll still be hopeful at the end of that.